Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. We start with the U.S. airstrike in Syria. Our European allies supportive of the attack, but the Russians condemning it, and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley saying the U.S. is prepared to take even more action, but she hopes it will not be necessary. We're going to have a lot of this with politics and the latest news, but first let's go to Kenneth Moten, who's live in Washington. Kenneth.
Good evening. President Trump's administration has been busy today briefing members of Congress and telling the international community the president had every right to launch that military strike. Today, members of Congress asking the Trump administration what's next after his first major military action, strikes on Syria. 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from 2 American warships in the Mediterranean, striking a Syrian airbase. President Trump giving the order from his Mar-a-Lago estate, changing his mind about Syrian President Bashar al-Assad after this week's deadly chemical weapons attack.
Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death.
Syria and Russia calling the strike an act of aggression. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley at an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council.
It is in our vital national security interest to prevent the spread and use of chemical weapons.
Senators were briefed Friday on Capitol Hill. All agree Assad needs to be held accountable, disagreeing after Trump didn't ask for congressional approval to strike.
The power to declare war resides in Congress. It was illegal for President Obama to bomb Libya. It's also illegal for President Trump to bomb Syria.
You got to bring this to Congress with a plan that tells Congress what is involved, what's the end game.
The top Republican in the Senate says at this point that debate is not needed.
I think this strike was simply about don't use chemical weapons again. That's what this strike was about. So I don't think it necessarily leads to another conclusion.
But many members of Congress say Assad must go, and they want a comprehensive plan from the Trump administration. Reporting live here on Capitol Hill, Kenneth Moten, ABC News. Back to you.
And for more, let's bring in Congressman Jim Himes, a Democrat from Connecticut, and he sits on the all-important Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you very much. As usual, a very busy day in Washington today. Let me ask you first off, last night's missile strikes, were they both a proportionate response, and do you support the president's decision?
Well, they were certainly proportionate, and I must tell you, I am, just as a person, very glad that a good chunk of Syrian President Assad's killing machinery is now lying in smoking ruins. These are weapons that would have been used over the coming months to do what he did last week and murder more innocent women and children. I will tell you, though, like everything in the Middle East, this is a little complicated. I am as disturbed that this went ahead without congressional approval as required by the Constitution as I was when Barack Obama did a similar attack on Libya. And I, of course, want to be very, very careful about what happens next. I'm a believer that this is probably limited, that we probably won't see a lot more action. The Russians won't respond. But in the Middle East, you never know. And we do not want to get into another quagmire that ends badly in the Middle East.
To that end, if you just look at the rhetoric from just this week, Congressman, from the administration, the president said at one point he's America's president, he's not the world's president. You have Secretary Tillerson basically saying, as well as also Ambassador Haley, that Syria isn't our problem. Then we see the attacks and the response after. You have Secretary Tillerson saying that either the Russians were complicit or ignorant. You have today Nikki Haley going out and saying that there could be more action for us to come. Do you have any idea what the policy, the worldview, or the plan is from this administration? Because really I thought the only concern was ISIS. Now it seems to be a much broader landscape, and all of a sudden Russia's an enemy.
Well, that's exactly right, and it shows that that the answer to your question is that this administration really doesn't have a consistent philosophy with respect to international affairs. And I don't just mean, we're going to treat all dictators the same or something like that. I mean, this was a president who really was isolationist in pretty much everything he said. America first was his slogan. And here we are acting as the world's policeman. Going in and engaging in military action when we were not attacked. And again, I don't quarrel that it wasn't the right thing to do from a moral standpoint. But it would appear that the president saw some photographs, as we all did, that appalled him, as it appalled all of us, and really sort of changed his philosophy on the fly. And I would just point out that we are at a dangerous moment here because, you know, the kind of action that we undertook in Syria is almost always done more appropriately and better when you have the world's help, when you work through a group like NATO, as we often do, or with the United Nations blessing or with the United Nations as a whole. These are two institutions, these more global institutions, which of course the president has targeted. So I do think that if he's not careful and he sort of follows through on this idea of a much more muscular interventionism without regard for organizations like NATO and the UN, we could really find ourselves in an enormously expensive and quite possibly perilous role of being the world's policeman.
You know, Congressman, you mentioned earlier the role of Congress, and certainly it's not relegated just to this president, but I think there's also some fair criticisms of some of your colleagues to say, yes, they want to have authority, but they also want to put their name to a vote, whether it be for an unpopular military action or voting against something, then being criticized when they have to have a primary. What is the appropriate role of Congress, and do some want to have it both ways?
Well, the answer to your first question is an easy one. The Constitution of the United States makes it very clear that it is Congress's responsibility and obligation to declare war, to initiate hostilities, as we saw hostilities initiated last night. And your second question is also fairly clear. Yeah, that's a tough responsibility. You really put yourself on the line in the way you don't when you vote on legislation that it might have to do about, you know, clean water or financial regulation. There are not many decisions quite as serious as voting for both the potential human tragedy as well as the expense of going to war. So yeah, it's awfully easy to say, gosh, I just don't want to do it. Which is what Congress has done for a very long time. And, of course, it's easy for the president to then take up that, to fill that vacuum and say, guess what, I will take that power. And that's not a good thing because, quite apart from the fact that it's not the way the Constitution envisioned that we would run the show here, but, you know, obviously when we engage, when we send our young people out and put them in harm's way and know that some of them will not come back, know that we may succeed or fail, it really puts us in a much better position if that decision is not one person and one person's alone, but it has the assent and has been fully debated by the representatives of the people. That's going into the world with a much stronger position than if it's just one person's decision.
Finally, and I'm asking the right person for this, certain networks today I've heard folks say, see what happened with what we did last night? That's proof positive that we don't have any unholy relationship, whether it be during the campaign or now, between the Russians and this administration. Just look what Tillerson and Haley said. Look at the president's actions yesterday. There's no there. This will have no impact, please tell me, on the investigation you guys are doing to figure out what happened during and leading up to the election and even after.
Of course it will have no impact. I mean, all of the many, many questions that my committee is investigating, all of these contacts with the Russians, the fact that a number of the people that had those contacts weren't honest about it, that doesn't go away. And let me share with you something that I really started believing as soon as I heard about the missile attacks. The Russians do not necessarily disapprove of this attack. Even to the Russians, somebody like Assad is pretty poisonous. They're in bed with a guy who drops chemical weapons on his own people. Look, the Russians have no particular fondness for Assad. What they care about is the preservation of their naval base in the town of Tartus, the naval access to the Mediterranean, and they care about being a player in the region. But I've believed all along, based on the study I've done as a member of the Intelligence Committee, that if they could find a way to get those goals accomplished without this awful guy that they have aligned with, they would take that deal in a second.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Congressman, thank you so much. Busy day. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
You, Richard.